The night, the countryside stopped sleeping. According to official records, the reign of Ukraine's most prolific killer ended almost quietly. No gunfight, no dramatic chase across fields, no last stand in a burning house. On the evening of 16th April, 1996, in an ordinary provincial town, officers from the security service and the police walked into a modest apartment and led out a man who did not struggle. His hands were cuffed, his head was slightly bowed, and his expression was unreadable. His name was Anatoly Onoprienko. Newspapers would come to call him the Beast of Ukraine. Within days, the number attached to his name would stun even hardened reporters. 52 dead. Whole families erased in a single night. Children shot where they slept. Farmhouses turned into blackened shells at the edge of villages no one outside the region had ever heard of. Even seasoned cops were shaken by this. Men who had worked crime scenes in the collapsing Soviet Union, who had seen shootings, robberies, and gang warfare in the wild 1990s, now sat in smoke-filled offices staring at photographs they could not easily classify. These were not gang hits, not drunken knife fights, not domestic disputes that spiraled out of control. This was something colder, a method moving from house to house, village to village, leaving nothing alive behind it. On paper, the pattern looks simple. Between 1989 and 1996, Anatoly Onoprienko traversed the landscape of Ukraine with a sawed-off shotgun and an appetite for annihilation. He chose isolated homes, waited until dark, forced his way in, and began with the father, the man of the house, the one most likely to resist. Then the mother, then the children. When there were no more living witnesses, he often set the house on fire, flames licking up wooden walls and thatched roofs, until all that remained in the morning was ash, twisted metal, and neighbors standing in stunned circles, whispering prayers into the smoke. But what happened next defies any logic you might expect from a story about mass murder. Because for years, these deaths did not assemble into a single horror in the public mind. They were scattered across regions and seasons. A family tragically killed in one oblast, a burned house in another, a car found abandoned on a roadside near a forest. Local papers wrote of bandits and unknown assailants. Police stations logged their cases in separate books. The country itself was changing, the Soviet Union dissolving, the fledgling state of Ukraine struggling to build new institutions out of old bones. In that noisy chaos of history, one quiet man moved along back roads and dirt tracks, killing without a pattern anyone was ready to see. According to official records, the first murders date back to 1989. A family of 10, 2 adults and 8 children, wiped out during what was initially treated as a brutal robbery. Later that same year, 5 people, among them an 11-year-old boy, were shot in their car as they slept, their bodies burned with the vehicle. Then, abruptly, the trail seems to pause, like a nightmare that someone might hope was over. It was not over. It was only waiting. In the autumn of 1995, the killings returned with a violence that felt almost mechanical. Small villages in central and western Ukraine began to wake to scenes that belonged, as one investigator later said, not to our reality, but to some other, colder world. A family of 4 here, a family of 5 there. Doors broken in, rooms torn apart, valuables missing, bodies dropped where they fell. Sometimes the killer left quickly. Sometimes he moved through the house as if he had all the time he needed, searching, rearranging, setting fire. In several cases, anyone unfortunate enough to be walking nearby, a pedestrian, a neighbor, a passing driver, was shot simply for crossing his path. But who would do this? Villagers asked, standing in snow-crusted fields and muddy lanes. staring at houses that were now crime scenes. The answers came slowly and in fragments. A stranger, a hunter, a man with a weapon, a car seen near the road the night before. Details accumulated like frost on a window, unclear but chilling. Inside police headquarters, maps were unrolled on tables. Pins marked villages whose names blurred into one another. Small places, forgotten places, where life ran on the same rhythm it had for decades. Work, family, church, the changing of the seasons. Now, red circles began to appear around those names, spreading like a rash across the countryside. In internal memos, officers referred simply to the killer or the maniac, as if writing his real name might give him more power. Some believe the truth was buried forever in those months, not only in the shallow graves and burned foundations of houses, but in lost reports and misfiled documents. There were too many killings, too quickly, in too many jurisdictions. One region blamed another. One station insisted the culprit was a local. Another swore he must be a roving bandit or a foreign mercenary. While the arguments dragged on, the bodies continued to appear. Outside, the country itself felt unsteady. These were the years of power cuts and unpaid wages, of factories falling silent, and new flags rising over old buildings. Railway stations were crowded with people leaving for other cities, other countries, other possible lives. But in the villages where the beast of Ukraine walked, there was no departure, only erasure. According to survivors, testimonies, the fear seeped into everything. Doors that had never been locked were bolted with chains. Men kept axes and hunting rifles near their beds. Mothers told children not to answer knocks after dark, no matter how familiar the voice. Priests spoke in their sermons about evil that did not wear a recognizable face. Dogs barked at nothing in the night. Somewhere, between one field and the next, a man moved with a shotgun under his coat, looking for his next unlit window. Years later, sitting behind bars, Anatoly Onoprienko would tell journalists and psychiatrists that he heard voices, that inner commands had driven him, that he had been chosen for this path. He would blame orphanages, neglect, fate, even God. "I am a tool," he once claimed, framing himself not as a predator, but as an instrument of something larger and darker than himself. The files, however, are less forgiving. They speak not of destiny, but of decisions. This story will follow those decisions, from a lonely childhood in rural Zhytomyr Oblast to the years when families began to die in numbers that made no sense. From the panicked manhunt that almost condemned the wrong suspect to death, to the quiet evening in 1996 when the real killer finally opened his door to the police. Along the way, we will move between official records and the memories of those who lived through his terror, between what the law could prove and what people still whisper when they pass certain blackened ruins at the edge of their villages. Because in the case of the beast of Ukraine, the question is not only how one man killed 52 people, it is also how an entire landscape for 7 long years failed to see the shape of the monster walking through it. Block 2, a childhood written in missing pages, according to official records. Anatoly Yuryovich Onoprienko was born in 1959 in a small village in Zhytomyr Oblast. One more child in a country that preferred numbers to names. His early years, at least on paper, are thin. A father, a mother, an older brother, a modest peasant household. A few lines in local registries, a school enrollment, nothing that hints at what he would one day become. Then, abruptly, the handwriting changes. His mother died when he was still a small boy. Different sources give different ages, but all agree on one detail. She disappeared from his life before he had any chance to understand what death truly meant. Shortly afterward, His father, overwhelmed or unwilling, handed the child over to the state. The boy was placed in an orphanage, a word that sounds neutral until you imagine the concrete walls, the iron beds, the corridors that smell of disinfectant and boiled food. An older brother remained with the family. Anatoly did not. That decision, made quietly in some cramped Soviet office, split his life in two. One son would grow up in a home, however poor and flawed. The other would learn that he was essentially surplus. Former staff from such institutions described the orphanages of those years with careful understatement. Overcrowded, underfunded, disciplinary. Children learned to fight for attention, for food, for scraps of warmth. The line between affection and authority was thin and often crossed. Punishments were harsh, sometimes arbitrary. There was no space for grief, no time to process loss. If you cried too much, they beat you for being weak. One former orphan once said of similar conditions, "So you stopped crying. That does not mean you stopped feeling." Anatoly would later claim that everything started there, in those dormitories where the lights went out early and whispers traveled from bed to bed like small frightened animals. He spoke of being humiliated, of being treated as less than human, of growing up convinced that the world had already decided he was unwanted. Whether these accounts were honest memories or convenient justifications is impossible to know, but they fit disturbingly well with what psychologists would later find inside his mind: a vast, cold emptiness where other people's suffering did not register as real. According to personnel records, he did not excel academically. He drifted through the standard Soviet pathways for unwanted youth, vocational training, manual labor, temporary postings. At various points, he worked on ships, in low-skilled jobs, in places where you can pass months without anyone bothering to ask who you really are. He had relationships, brief and shallow. He moved often. He cultivated, deliberately or instinctively, the ability to vanish into the background of any scene. People who encountered him in those years describe a man who was not especially remarkable. Average height, dark hair, sometimes quiet, sometimes talkative in a superficial way, joking, complaining, blending in. The sort of man you would not remember on a crowded bus. Yet even in these bland recollections, small notes stand out: an odd, intense stare, a tendency to lie about minor things for no apparent reason, a habit of watching others closely as if studying their weaknesses. It is here that the record begins to fray. There are gaps in his employment history, stretches of time where his whereabouts are not clearly documented. In some files, pages appear to have been removed. Transfers between institutions are recorded without explanation. A reprimand here, a disciplinary note there, then a sudden unexplained shift to another region. On their own, these irregularities could be dismissed as routine Soviet bureaucracy. Together, they feel like footsteps in mud, visible but hard to follow. Some believe the truth was buried forever in those missing months, that early acts of violence may have gone unnoticed or been quietly misclassified. In a system that preferred not to admit its own failures, it was easier to label a sudden death as an accident, a random assault as drunken hooliganism, than to acknowledge the possibility of something more systematic lurking beneath the surface. What is certain is that by the late 1980s, Anatoly Onoprienko was drifting back toward rural Ukraine, carrying with him a lifetime's worth of resentment and a worldview that no longer recognized ordinary human bonds. He had tried to form a family of his own. Relationships had failed. He had no stable job, no deep roots, no community that would notice if he disappeared for days at a time. Inside, by his own later admission, a conviction had taken hold, that he had been rejected by society and therefore owed society nothing. A psychologist who interviewed him after his arrest described his emotional life as stripped bare, like an abandoned house with the windows broken and the doors kicked in. He spoke of his childhood not with sorrow, but with a kind of icy contempt, as if the boy he once was were just another victim, already distanced and depersonalized. According to his own later statements, it was around this time that he began to experience what he called signals or commands. He claimed that something, fate, God, voices, destiny, had marked him out at different times. He framed this as a spiritual calling, a response to injustice, or a form of cosmic balance. It is impossible to know how much of this he actually believed and how much he constructed as a story to make sense of his own impulses. But one detail is unnervingly clear. He saw himself as chosen. "The world rejected me," he would say, "so I rejected the world." In 1989, this inner script translated, for the first time on record, into action that could no longer be mistaken for anything else. A family of 10 was annihilated in a single night. A few months later, a group asleep in a car was gunned down and burned. These were not crimes of passion, not drunken brawls, not domestic quarrels spiraling out of control. They were executions, carried out with a weapon already prepared, a plan already shaped, a hatred already cold. But even here, at the point where his private darkness finally spilled into public reality, something strange happened. The investigations that followed those first massacres did not converge on a single coherent suspect. Files were opened and filed away. Local suspects were questioned. Theories were floated about bandits, gang revenge, armed robbers passing through. Somewhere in those thickets of speculation, the name Anatoly Onoprienko flickered briefly, then vanished again, swallowed by noise, by lack of proof, by the simple human tendency to look for more ordinary explanations. Even seasoned cops, who would later spend sleepless nights revisiting these early cases, admit that at the time, they could not imagine one man doing such things to strangers without any clear motive. Murder, yes. Robbery, yes. But this total erasure of households, this systematic turning of homes into pyres, it did not fit any pattern they recognized. And so, in a terrible way, it did not fully register. The records from 1989 close like a door half shut, unresolved, unsettling, incomplete. For a few years, the beast of Ukraine stepped back into the shadows. Whether he truly paused or simply chose victims whose deaths left fewer traces, we may never know. What we do know is that when he returned in 1995, he did so with a speed and ferocity that would make those earlier crimes look almost like rehearsals. The boy from the orphanage, the unwanted son, the drifting worker, all of those masks would fall away, one by one, as the countryside discovered what had been growing quietly in its blind spots for years. The map was still clean. The pins had not yet been placed. The monster was already moving. Block 3, Nights of Fire and Footsteps in the Snow. According to official records, the first massacre that can be firmly linked to Anatoly Onoprienko took place in 1989 in a quiet rural settlement that, until then, barely appeared in any national register. It was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlatched and knew the sound of each neighbor's footsteps on the dirt road. By morning, 10 people from a single extended family were dead. Adults, children, grandparents, wiped out in a few minutes of controlled, methodical violence. The file calls it a brutal robbery accompanied by multiple homicides. The photographs call it something else. Investigators arriving on the scene found chaos frozen in place. Overturned chairs, splintered wood, scattered clothes, a cradle knocked sideways, blood on the floorboards and footprints. As if someone had moved from room to room with grim purpose and then walked out again, leaving only silence behind. The father had been shot first, near the entrance, as if he had tried to confront the intruder. The others were killed where they slept or where they stood, some still in nightclothes, some with hands raised instinctively in front of their faces. Even seasoned cops were shaken by this. They had seen violence before, But not this deliberate completion. No one spared as a witness. No message left. No sign that the killer knew the victims personally. It felt, one officer later admitted, like a storm that decided to fall only on one house and then vanish. Theories multiplied quickly. Some investigators believe they were looking at the work of organized bandits, a gang passing through, armed and ruthless, uninterested in leaving survivors. Others insisted the crime had to be personal, the result of a vendetta, an old grudge that had finally erupted. The sheer scale of the killing made it hard for anyone to accept a simpler, more chilling possibility: that a stranger had chosen this family for no reason that made sense in human terms. The case remained officially unsolved. Suspicion fell on several local men. Some were detained, interrogated, released. A few names found their way into confidential notes as likely involved. The name Onoprienko drifted across one or two memos and then away again, like smoke. Later that same year, another scene unfolded, this time on a stretch of road where a car had been parked for the night. Inside, 5 people slept. Travelers who thought the darkness and the countryside would keep them safe. They did not make it to morning. Someone approached the vehicle, fired into it at close range, then set it ablaze. By the time anyone reached the spot, the car was a charred carcass, metal twisted, windows melted, the bodies inside fused to seats and each other. The killings had the same signature: no warning, no survivors, no visible motive beyond total destruction. But once again, the pattern did not stick. According to reports from that period, these crimes were recorded in separate districts under separate case numbers, handled by different teams, discussed in different rooms by men who did not yet realize they were looking at fragments of the same nightmare. The Soviet system was straining under its own weight. Resources were thin, coordination imperfect, and the idea of a mobile, motiveless mass killer stalking the countryside did not fit the mental framework of many senior officers. Then, for a while, the storm seemed to pass. From 1990 to 1994, there were other crimes in Ukraine, of course: robberies, murders, gang clashes, but nothing that clearly bore the same terrifying hallmarks as those early massacres. There are hints, scattered in local archives, of unsolved killings that some later tried to retroactively connect to Onoprienko: a roadside shooting here, a boned homestead there. Yet none of these links could be proven to the satisfaction of a court. Officially, the beast of Ukraine went quiet. Unofficially, no one can say for certain what he was doing. Some investigators believe he did, in fact, pause. That pressure, fear of being caught, or a temporary shift in his inner turmoil forced him to hold back. Others suspect that he simply became more careful, choosing victims less likely to draw attention, in places where record-keeping was poor and local authorities eager to close files quickly. In the absence of clear evidence, this 4-year gap has become its own dark legend, a blank stretch of road on which anything might have happened. What is not in doubt is what came next. In late 1995, as the first snow began to fall on fields and village lanes, the killings started again, this time with a speed and regularity that made it impossible to pretend they were isolated incidents. In one village, a family of 4, parents and 2 small children, shot in their home, valuables taken, house set ablaze. In another, a family of 5, similar method, similar scene, similar stunned neighbors standing outside in the morning light, their breath hanging in the air like ghosts. According to survivor testimony from one such village, the night always started ordinarily. A dog barking, wind scraping bare branches against windows, distant engine noises on the road. Then, somewhere between one gust of wind and the next, came a different sound. The dull crack of a door being forced, the heavy thud of boots in a hallway, the short, brutal thunder of shotgun blasts in close quarters. By the time neighbors woke fully and stumbled outside, hearts pounding, hands shaking as they pulled on coats and boots, The house was already burning. Flames framed in the windows like something alive and triumphant. Witness statements from these nights share eerie similarities. A stranger seen earlier in the day, walking near the village. A vehicle parked a little too far from the houses, lights off. A man asking for directions. His face unremarkable, his manner calm. Then darkness, then fire, then sirens wailing through sleeping streets that had never heard such sounds before. Inside police headquarters, the atmosphere shifted from concern to alarm. Maps came out again, this time under harsher lighting and more urgent hands. Red pins marked each new scene. Here, a burned house. There, a shot-up car. Further west, another family erased. The arcs between these points suggested movement. Not a local dispute, not a static gang, but something traveling, something choosing places according to its own logic. He is roaming, one officer scrawled in a margin. He is hunting. Even seasoned cops admitted they felt something close to dread. They were trying to catch a man who left almost nothing behind that could be used to identify him. No clear fingerprints, no distinctive personal item dropped at a scene, no boastful messages or taunts. His signature was absence of life, of witnesses, of anything that might explain why this house, why this family, why this night. Some believe the truth was buried forever in the chaos of those months. Investigative leads lost because telephones didn't work, because snow delayed travel, because one district did not share information quickly enough with another. In the newly independent Ukraine, institutions were still finding their feet. Budgets were tight, equipment was old. In that fragile environment, the beast of Ukraine moved like a shadow through structural cracks. On the ground, fear turned practical. Villagers organized night watches, taking turns to patrol with flashlights and old hunting rifles. Men who had never been in a police station found themselves standing in cramped offices, trying to describe suspicious strangers to sketch artists. Mothers slept lightly, waking at every creak of the floorboards. Children were told stories, not of wolves and fairy tale monsters, but of a real man with a real gun who might come if they did not stay inside and keep quiet. Yet for all the crude precautions, extra bars on windows, weapons kept under pillows, there was one weakness no one could fix. Geography. Farmhouses sat alone at the edge of fields. Villages were separated by long stretches of road. Darkness covered everything quickly after sunset. For a man willing to drive long distances, to walk across frozen ground, to knock on doors late at night and force his way in, the countryside was not a barrier. It was a hunting ground. According to later reconstructions, Anatoly Onoprienko was not improvising in these months. He followed a rough method. Approach an isolated house. Watch it. Choose a time when the family was most vulnerable. Enter fast. Shoot first. Ask questions later, if at all. Take whatever money, jewelry, or weapons were available. Erase the scene with fire. Leave before help could possibly arrive. But just as the pattern began to solidify in the minds of investigators, something else went wrong. Something that would lead to one of the most haunting mistakes of the entire case. Under immense pressure to find someone, anyone, who could be blamed for the growing list of massacres, police focused on a different suspect in a separate case. A man who fit parts of a profile, who had access to weapons, who seemed, on the surface, capable of violence. Their attention narrowed. Resources shifted. Files thickened around the wrong name. While that man sat in custody, protesting his innocence, the beast of Ukraine was still out there, driving through the night, watching unlit windows, counting how many shadows moved behind the curtains of houses that did not yet know their hours were numbered. The map now bristled with pins. The snow bore the imprint of boots that no one yet recognized. The countryside had stopped sleeping. And the monster had not finished. Block 4. The wrong suspect and the man who stepped forward. According to official records, by early 1996, the pressure on Ukrainian law enforcement had reached a breaking point. The list of dead families was no longer a set of separate tragedies. Newspapers and television had begun to join the dots. People spoke not only of murders, but of a maniac roaming the countryside, an invisible presence that could appear at any door after dark. Under that weight, the system made a terrible mistake. Investigators in one region focused their attention on a local man with a criminal background. He owned weapons. He had a temper. Neighbors described him as unstable, capable of violence. In the fog of fear and political pressure, these details began to look, to some, like an answer. He was arrested, questioned, and, according to later reports, pushed repeatedly to confess to crimes he insisted he had not committed. In internal documents from that period, you can trace the tightening circle. His name appears on more and more pages, linked to more and more unsolved cases. Diagrams in the margins connect him to weapons, to locations, to rumors. The narrative was forming, a narrative that risked ending with an innocent man taking the blame for horrors he had not carried out. Even seasoned cops would later admit, quietly, that they felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. "We were hunting a ghost," one officer said, "and when we finally caught someone solid, it was tempting to force the ghost to fit his shape." All the while, the real killer kept moving. In those same weeks, there were fresh attacks. Another family silenced. Another farmhouse burning against the winter sky. A witness glimpsed a figure leaving the scene. Not the man in custody, but someone else. A neighbor described a different car. Details did not quite match. Somewhere between the statements, doubts began to creep in. According to one investigator, the turning point came during a late-night review of case files. A small group of officers sat in a smoky office, walls covered with maps and photographs. They laid out every massacre in chronological order, ignoring previous assumptions, ignoring the name that had come to dominate their paperwork. They looked only at method, movement, and timing. The pattern that emerged made one thing horrifyingly clear. While their suspect sat behind bars, at least some of the killings had continued. "But if he is in custody," a young officer said, pointing at dates on the wall, "who is doing this?" The question hung in the air like a bad smell. No one wanted to answer it, because the answer meant admitting that they had been wrong, that the real beast of Ukraine was still out there, and that every day spent pursuing the wrong man had been a day given to the monster as a gift. Some believe the truth was buried forever in those frantic internal debates. Notes destroyed, memos softened, decisions quietly reversed, without full acknowledgement of how close the system had come to a fatal miscarriage of justice. What remains, however, is undeniable. The focus shifted. The local suspect would not become the official face of the killings. The search widened again. At the same time, a different thread began to form, far from conference rooms and court files. In a small town, a man named Anatoly Onoprienko was drifting between temporary addresses, visiting relatives, staying with a woman who believed he was simply a troubled, difficult partner. He talked occasionally about his childhood, about the orphanage, about feeling wronged by the world. He also kept weapons, moved without leaving deep tracks, and disappeared for days without a convincing explanation. According to witness accounts later recorded in court, he had a way of switching moods quickly. Calm and polite one moment, cold and distant the next. People around him sensed something off but could not name it, could not imagine its true scale. They saw a man with a temper, not a man carrying 52 deaths in his shadow. Then came a quarrel. Different sources describe it differently. An argument about money, about behavior, about fear. What they all agree on is that it shook the fragile structure of his personal life. Words were said. Threats were hinted. Someone close to him finally decided that enough was enough and went to the police. In mid-April 1996, officers received a tip that pointed not to a vague stranger, but to a specific man living in a specific place, with access to weapons and an unsettling history. By then, the special task force assembled to hunt the family killer was exhausted, skeptical, and painfully aware of past missteps. Still, they followed the lead. The approach to his apartment was almost disappointingly ordinary. No bullets, no barricades. A stairwell that smelled of dust and cooking oil. A door like any other in a dull, worn building. Yet the air, as one officer later recalled, felt oddly heavy. "We knew," he said. "We did not say it, but we knew this visit was different." They knocked. The man who opened the door looked tired rather than surprised. He did not slam it. He did not reach for a weapon in a final act of defiance. He listened as they asked questions. He answered some. And then, in a way that even today feels more like something from a grim fairy tale than a police report, he began to talk. According to several accounts, he did not admit everything at once. The first admissions were careful, almost experimental, as if he were testing how much they already knew. But soon the partial truths gave way to something else, a flood. He began to list scenes, a family here, a car there, a burned house in one oblast, children shot in another. He described roads, layouts of homes, the position of bodies. He mentioned numbers casually, as if counting objects rather than people. The officers listening started to realize, with a slow, sickening feeling, that this was not the confession of a man trying to escape responsibility by exaggerating or inventing. This was a memory unspooling. Even seasoned cops were shaken by this. One of them later said that as he listened to Onoprienko speak, he felt as if the temperature in the room were dropping with each sentence. This was not rage. This was not madness in the theatrical sense. This was cold, organized recall. Then came the number, 52. Not 5, not 10. 52 lives, claimed in a tone that was eerily flat. When they asked him if he understood what that meant, he reportedly shrugged and said something that would haunt them for years, that he had done what he was meant to do, and that the responsibility lay with those who had abandoned him long before he ever picked up a gun. According to official records, the interrogation transcripts from those first hours and days became the backbone of the case. They were cross-checked against old files, crime scene photographs, witness statements. One by one, the massacres that had seemed unconnected snapped into place along a single, horrifying line. Yet even in these confessions, there were gaps and contradictions, names he could not recall, locations he described imperfectly, killings investigators had not yet tied to him, but that sounded disturbingly familiar. Some believe that in those missing details lie still unknown crimes. Victims whose families never received a phone call, a visit, or a case number. By the time the sun rose on the day after his arrest, the map on the task force wall had changed forever. The wrong suspect's name was quietly pushed aside. The pins on the map no longer floated without an anchor. The beast of Ukraine had finally given himself a human face, and the question was no longer whether he had done it, but how much of what he was now claiming the country was ready to hear. Block 5, maps, numbers, and the holes between them. According to official records, the arrest of Anatoly Onoprienko in April 1996 marked a turning point. Until that moment, the story of the family massacres existed in fragments, separate files, separate griefs, separate villages trying to make sense of their own personal catastrophe. Once his name was written at the top of the case folders, everything began to pull inward, drawn toward a single, unbearable center. The first task was simple in theory and almost impossible in practice: count the dead. In a cramped operations room, investigators spread photographs, reports, and hand-drawn diagrams across tables. crime scene numbers were matched against his statements. The first massacres from 1989 were placed alongside those of 1995 and 1996. Dates, locations, methods, witness recollections, all of it was lined up, like bones laid out for an autopsy. He had said 52. The files, once they were collated, came close to that number. Close, but not perfectly aligned. There were murders he remembered in unsettling detail that had never been properly registered. There were case files of burned houses and shot families he did not initially mention, but which matched his pattern so precisely that coincidence felt like a coward's explanation. There were gaps in his narrative. There were gaps in theirs. Even seasoned cops were shaken by this arithmetic. It is one thing to handle a homicide file. It is another to sit in a room and realize that the man you interrogated yesterday might be responsible for more deaths in your country than some wars. According to official records, the list of victims would eventually solidify into the number that would define him: 52 people. Killed in a series of attacks between 1889 and 1996. Whole families, lone travelers, unfortunate witnesses who stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. The judgments, when they came, would repeat this number like a refrain. But what happened next defies any comforting belief that a number can fully contain a tragedy. Because for every victim whose name made it into the final count, there were others who existed only as question marks. In remote districts, old policemen recalled unsolved shootings that had never been properly investigated. A burned cottage here, an abandoned car there. Some relatives, hearing that a family killer had been caught, came forward with stories of their own, lost brothers, cousins, neighbors, and asked whether their dead might also belong to his shadow. The answer, more often than not, was this: we cannot prove it. Proof, in a case like this, requires more than intuition. It requires dates, physical traces, witness statements that match. In a country passing through the collapse of one system and the halting construction of another, such neat documentation was rare. Some believe the truth was buried forever in those years of transition. Murders filed under the wrong heading, evidence lost during office moves, bullet casings swept away with ordinary trash. They will tell you that the number 52 is not a ceiling, but a floor, the minimum we can prove, not the maximum he may have done. While detectives wrestled with this, another process began, turning this man, this collection of confessions and contradictions, into a subject for experts. Psychiatrists and psychologists were called in. They met him not in a dark cell, but in bare, echoing rooms, where the walls were watched and every word was recorded. They asked about his childhood, his anger, his claimed voices. He answered with a mix of self-pity and frightening detachment. Sometimes he spoke of himself as a victim, abandoned by his family and by the state. At other times, he described killings with such flatness that the professionals listening had to remind themselves that he was talking about human beings and not broken objects. According to later summaries of these assessments, he was found to be sane in the legal sense. No psychosis that robbed him of understanding. No mental illness that could explain away his actions as the product of a mind detached from reality. What emerged instead was a portrait of extreme antisocial personality traits, profound lack of empathy, an inflated sense of his own specialness, an instrumental view of other people as tools or obstacles. He was not, by their judgment, a madman in chains. He was something colder, a man who knew what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. Yet even these clinical reports left a residue of unease. He frequently framed his crimes as a kind of mission shaped by forces outside himself. He blamed orphanages, relatives, society at large. "I am a mirror," he is reported to have said, "I only gave back what the world showed me." For some, this sounded like manipulation. For others, it was a glimpse into a self-constructed mythology that allowed him to live with what he had done. While experts wrote their diagnoses, the media wrote a legend. Newspapers ran headlines that paired his photograph with words like beast, butcher, executioner. Television crews traveled to the villages where he had walked unrecognized months earlier and filmed the blackened ruins of houses, the warped frames of windows that once held curtains, not fire. Neighbors spoke into microphones, their faces pale and rigid. "We heard shots," they said. "We saw flames." One woman simply repeated, "Children, there were children," until the reporter cut away. In the cities, people read these stories on crowded buses and trams, feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread. Relief that someone had been caught. Dread that for so long he had not. Parents who had followed the news of the killings now looked at their sleeping children and imagined what those other nights must have looked like. According to official records, threats and rumors continued to swirl even after his arrest. He allegedly told investigators that he could have killed more, that catching him was not a triumph of skill, but a quirk of fate. In some versions of his statements, he hinted that there were other men like him, or that his crimes were part of a larger, hidden design. No evidence has ever substantiated such claims, but they serve one purpose well. They kept the fear alive, behind the scenes. Controversy brewed over the way the investigation had been handled. Why had those early massacres not triggered a nationwide hunt sooner? How close had an innocent man come to being convicted in his place? Were there warnings ignored, reports shelved, patterns missed through negligence or simple disbelief? These questions did not always reach the public, but they echoed in corridors and closed-door meetings. Even seasoned cops, men not prone to self-criticism, admitted that the case had exposed painful weaknesses in coordination, in record-keeping, in the very ability to imagine that something like this could happen here, in their fields, in their villages. And while adults argued and experts theorized, the countryside quietly adjusted to the new reality. Some farmhouses that had been attacked were rebuilt. Others were left as they were, charred skeletons at the edge of fields, gradually sinking back into the earth. Children who grew up near them heard the story of the beast of Ukraine not as a news item, but as a warning, told at dusk. This is what happens when doors are not locked, when strangers are trusted too easily, when the world beyond our village is allowed to seep in. Officially, this story was now marching toward the trials, toward indictments, cross-examinations, sentencing. Unofficially, it had already spilled out of the files and into something larger, a shadow cast over an entire era, a symbol of how fragile the border is between normal life and unthinkable horror. The maps had been drawn, the numbers had been tallied, but somewhere between the pins on the wall and the names in the registers, there remained empty spaces, places where no one could say with total certainty what had happened, or to whom, or how many times the monster had walked through the snow while the countryside slept and did not know it was being watched. Block 6, the trial, the death sentence, and a life that would not end. According to official records, once the confessions had been transcribed and the maps on the wall had been filled with pins, there was only one place left for the story to go: the courtroom. The beast of Ukraine, who had moved through fields and farmhouses like a shadow, was about to be pinned down by procedure, by timetables, by legal arguments, by men and women in robes reading laws from heavy books. On paper, it looked straightforward. A defendant, 52 murders, mountains of evidence. In reality, nothing about it was simple. The trials drew people the way fires draw moths. Reporters, relatives of the dead, curious onlookers, even former investigators who were no longer officially connected to the case. They all found reasons to be there. Some came every day, sitting on hard benches until their backs ached, listening to testimony that felt like having old wounds reopened with deliberate slowness. Others came only once, unable to bear more, but needing to see the man who had turned their country's countryside into a hunting ground. When they brought him into the courtroom, he did not look like the monster from the headlines. No fangs, no wild eyes, just an ordinary man in a plain prison uniform, hands cuffed in front of him, hair beginning to thin, face composed. He glanced around the room the way a bored office worker might scan a bus for a free seat. When the charges were read, 52 murders, multiple armed robberies, unlawful possession of weapons, he listened in silence. Even seasoned cops were unsettled by how ordinary he appeared under the fluorescent lights. For years, they had imagined a figure that matched the horror of his acts, a giant, a raging madman, something visibly wrong. Instead, they saw a human frame like any other, a man who could have passed unnoticed in a crowd on any city street. Witness after witness took the stand. Neighbors from burned-out villages described what they had heard and seen: the sudden cracks of shotgun fire, the glow of flames behind curtains, the smell of smoke, and something else that they did not want to name: the sight of bodies carried out under sheets in the gray light of dawn. Survivors spoke in low voices. A man who had arrived late to a visit and found only ruins. A relative who had walked into a house that felt wrong the moment the door opened. Silence pressing against his ears like a physical weight. Officers described crime scenes with clinical precision. Forensic experts explained burn patterns, bullet trajectories, and why the method used in one village matched the method used in another, hundreds of kilometers away. Psychiatrists presented their evaluations, speaking of a mind that understood the difference between right and wrong, but had stepped beyond caring. Some days the courtroom felt less like a place for justice and more like a laboratory where the anatomy of evil was being slowly, painfully dissected. And then there were the moments when he spoke. At times, he refused to answer questions, staring past the prosecutor, as if the entire process bored him. At other moments, he launched into monologues about his childhood, about being abandoned, about seeing himself as a chosen instrument. Sometimes he denied this or that specific killing. Sometimes he seemed to boast. His tone shifted unpredictably, offended, indifferent, almost amused. According to those who sat close enough to hear every word, the most chilling part was not when he described violence. It was when he distanced himself from it. "I am not guilty," he would say, "because I was made this way." Or, if the state had not abandoned me, none of this would have happened. In those moments, he seemed to place himself not in the dock, but above it, judging the same system that now judged him. The judges and lawyers, bound by their roles, focused on what could be proven. Shell casings that matched his shotgun, items taken from murdered families and later found in his possession, specific details of crime scenes that only the killer could have known. His own earlier statements read back to him line by line. According to official transcripts, the court found him responsible for 52 murders committed across several regions of Ukraine between 1989 and 1996. The language was sober, controlled, stripped of emotion. It spoke of episodes, victims, circumstances, aggravating factors. Behind each of those words, there were faces, birthdays never reached, lives violently cut off. When the verdict came, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty on all major counts. The sentence requested by the prosecution and imposed by the court was the harshest available under the law at that time: death by firing squad. Some relatives of victims wept quietly. Others sat very still, hands clasped, as if they did not quite trust what they had heard. For them, No sentence could bring back the dead. No judgment could erase the nights of terror and the years of uncertainty. But the words mattered. They drew a line between silence and acknowledgement, between rumors and an official truth. He showed little visible reaction. No pleading, no outburst, no collapse. If anything, as some observers noted, he seemed almost relieved, as though the long performance of the trial had exhausted him and a clear, final outcome, even one as severe as death, was easier to accept than endless waiting. In later interviews, he would claim he did not fear execution. He hinted that he saw it as a kind of completion, an inevitable end to a path he believed had been set for him long ago. But what happened next did not follow his private script. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Ukraine moved to abolish the death penalty as part of its commitments to align with European legal standards. The country was changing again, this time not through the collapse of an empire, but through the slow, grinding negotiations of international integration. Laws were amended, sentences were reviewed. Among them was the case of the Beast of Ukraine. According to official decisions, his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. The firing squad would not be called. There would be no final, theatrical end in a courtyard at dawn. Instead, he was transferred to a high-security facility. His world reduced to concrete, steel doors, scheduled walks, controlled visits, and the endless sameness of days, in a place built to hold men whose stories the outside world no longer wished to see. Even seasoned cops, who had once imagined the satisfaction, however grim, of knowing he would face the ultimate punishment, admitted to feeling an odd hollowness. He would not die quickly, dramatically, or publicly. He would simply go on, year after year. A life sentence for one man, measured against 52 stolen lives for which there could never be restitution. Inside prison walls, his legend shrank. To new inmates, he was at first a name they had heard from older prisoners or fragments of television broadcasts. Some were afraid of him, some were curious. With time, as happens even with monsters, familiarity dulled the edges. He became another figure in the yard, walking in slow circles under the watch of towers and cameras, occasionally talking to those who dared to approach, often standing alone. Guards noted peculiar habits. He sometimes spoke as if the outside world still revolved around him, as though people were constantly asking about his thoughts and feelings. At other times, he withdrew into long silences, staring at a fixed point, as if replaying scenes no one else could see. If remorse visited him, it left no clear trace in any report. According to official records, his life ended not with a bullet, but with heart failure in a prison hospital in 2013. No crowds gathered. No journalists packed the corridors. A man who had once terrified villages and filled front pages died in a controlled battle, fluorescent-lit space, surrounded not by family, but by staff and other convicts. On the form where the cause of death was logged, there was no special note, no black border around his name. Just another entry in a system that records everything the same way. Whether it is the passing of a petty thief or the last breath of the Beast of Ukraine, the state had finished with him. But the country had not finished with his shadow. Because even after his body was taken away and his cell reassigned, questions remained about how he had become what he was, about how many warnings had been missed, and about what his long, quiet years behind bars really meant in the face of so many lives that had simply stopped on cold nights in houses that never had the chance to grow old. Block 7. The villages that still count their dead. According to official records, the case of Anatoly Onoprienko is closed. The killer is dead. The judgments have been written. The number 52 has been fixed in legal memory, printed in textbooks and crime digests as if it were the final word. In the language of the state, What was once chaos has been turned into a completed file, stored somewhere in a climate-controlled archive. But what happened next refused to stay neatly filed away. In the villages where he walked, the story did not end with his death in 2013. It settled over fields and farmhouses like a slow, persistent fog. Children who were not yet born when the houses burned grew up pointing at blackened foundations at the edge of town and saying, "That's where the beast came." Parents corrected them softly, "That's where people lived." But the nickname stuck. It was easier to remember the monster than the names of the families he erased. Some of those ruins were rebuilt. New walls went up on old foundations. Fresh paint covered scorch marks. Curtains were hung over windows that had once framed flames. Yet even in these renewed houses, something felt slightly off, as if the ground underneath had not fully agreed to forget. Visitors spoke of a strange heaviness in certain rooms, a cold patch in one corner, a feeling of being watched when they passed through the doorway, where the door had once been kicked in. Of course, none of this appears in official documents. Bureaucratic language does not have a column for unease. Instead, the records speak of compensation payments, of reconstruction, of community support. They do not mention the farmer who refuses to walk past a particular spot on the road after dark because on a winter night years ago, that was where he saw a car burning and heard, under the crackle of fire, a single human voice that did not sound like it belonged entirely to this world. They do not record the woman who wakes at the same hour every night, convinced she heard footsteps on a wooden floor that no longer exists. Some believe the truth was buried forever, not only in what he did, but in what the system chose not to explore once it had him in chains. There are still retired officers who will tell you, if you find them in the right mood, that the number 52 never sat comfortably with them. They remember unexplained deaths on lonely roads, unsolved shootings in small towns. Cases shelved during the turbulent early 1990s because there were not enough men or vehicles to investigate properly. "We did what we could," one of them says, but the country was falling apart. Files were lost. People moved away. Who knows how many stories broke off mid-sentence? In some of those older reports, the method looks disturbingly familiar. Close-range shotgun blasts, valuables taken, a vehicle abandoned just beyond the last houses. Yet no court ever tied those deaths to him. No judge read their names in the same breath as the 52. Officially, they remain separate, orphaned crimes. Unofficially, they are part of the shadow that trails behind his name. Then there are the conspiracies, the theories that grow in the cracks left by uncertainty. Some whisper that he could not have acted entirely alone, that someone must have helped him scout locations, acquire weapons, or dispose of stolen goods. Others insist that certain local officials, embarrassed by earlier failures, quietly discouraged attempts to link older cases to the beast of Ukraine once the main trial was over. "Leave the past alone," they quote unnamed superiors as saying. "We have our verdict. That is enough." There is no solid proof for these claims, only fragments, a missing page in an old file, a retired clerk who remembers a document that no longer exists, a note in the margin of a report that trails off halfway through a sentence. But in a landscape where whole families disappeared in a single night, doubt is easy to cultivate and hard to uproot. Even seasoned cops lower their voices when the conversation turns to him. They speak of the case as if it were not entirely over, as if some part of it still sits in the corner of the room, listening. "We caught the man," one says, "but I am not sure we caught the whole story." Another admits that, to this day, he avoids looking too long at maps of those years. The red circles start to feel like open eyes. For younger Ukrainians, the beast has become a kind of grim legend, a reference point in discussions about evil, justice, and the fragility of ordinary life. His name appears in documentaries, in articles, in late-night conversations among students who were too young to remember the fear, but old enough to inherit its echo. Some treat his story as a cautionary tale about social collapse and neglected children. Others see it as a symbol of something more uncomfortable, the way entire communities can be blindsided by a horror that does not announce itself until it is already inside the house. According to official records, the measures taken after his arrest, improved coordination between regions, better data sharing, new approaches to serial crime, were steps meant to ensure that nothing like this could happen again. On paper, the system learned from the beast of Ukraine. But the countryside where he hunted is still full of dark roads, isolated homes, and winter nights when the wind carries sounds in strange ways. For every monster the state identifies and names, there are others whose violence remains small enough, local enough, or lucky enough to slip between categories. A man who kills once, twice, 3 times, in places where attention is scarce, may never become a headline. He may die known only to a handful of people and a few overworked officers in one district. The question that lingers, long after the prison hospital closed its file on Anatoly Onoprienko, is not just why he became what he was. It is how many times the world almost produced another version of him and then looked away in time to avoid noticing. If you travel through the regions where he walked and ask old people about those years, some will shake their heads and say they prefer not to remember. Others will talk freely, pouring out details they have carried for decades. The burned house, the sirens, the smell of wet ashes in the morning, the silence at funerals where there were more coffins than pallbearers. And if you stand at the edge of one of those rebuilt homesteads at dusk, as the light drains out of the fields and the sky turns the color of old photographs, you may feel it too, that thin line between the normal and the unthinkable, between a warm kitchen and a dark doorway, between a quiet man on a road and a predator passing through a world that does not yet know it is being marked. Officially, the beast of Ukraine is gone. Unofficially, he remains wherever the country remembers that for 7 long years, there was a monster walking among ordinary people, and no one realized how many footsteps they were hearing until the last house had already burned.